Good evening. I forgot about our young people's tradition on Spring Series nights of intimidating the speakers. No, this is actually encouraging the speakers. So they are just wonderful examples to all of us. I like people who sit up front. Usually people are fighting for the back pew, but you guys like to sit up front. I appreciate y'all very much. And so excited to be able to start our Spring Series tonight. Our theme, as you probably already know, is tests of the Bible. And I think it's a particularly applicable theme for us because as humans living in this world, we're tested every day. We have a song that goes, "Tempted and Tried." And we are tempted and tried as a part of the human experience. It's a part of life. Every week, we're going to be focusing on a text from Scripture that tells us how to navigate the tests of life. And we're starting tonight with Brother Dewayne Bryant. Dewayne was with us last year. You might remember, I believe it was in the spring for one of our Fifth Sundays. And he did an excellent series of lessons on the resurrection. And we are so glad that he agreed to come back and to bring his family again. He brought his family last time. We're so glad that he brought his wife, Krista, and their daughters with them tonight. And if you haven't had a chance to meet them, take a chance to get to know them this evening. It's a wonderful family, and I'm just so honored that they are here with us tonight. Dewayne teaches at Faulkner University. As you probably know from his being with us last year, he's a very capable instructor, very interesting teacher of the Bible. And you don't get to attend Faulkner, most of you, and sit in his classes, so if you want to see more of Dewayne, and I recommend that you do, check out his YouTube channel. He does some good work on YouTube. Just search for Dewayne Bryant, and you'll find him there. And subscribe to his channel. He puts out a lot of good content. I've gained a lot from it, and you will too. His lesson tonight is the testimony of faith, the test of worldly wisdom. Get your Bibles, open up to Daniel chapter 1. Let's hear Dewayne talk to us about the test of worldly wisdom.
I think I'm on. We had a wonderful time the last time we were here, and it's exciting to get to be here with you again to talk about a subject that is one of those that is, I think, extremely applicable to us practically every day. And I want to pull out one very specific thing at the end where this is very much the case, I think, for practically everyone in this world, at least in this auditorium. So if you want to go with me to Daniel chapter 1, we're going to go and read through some of the text here. And it is going to be a little bit before what Drew read at the beginning of our time tonight. We're going to go all the way back to the very first verse. All right, so Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 to 7 is where we're going to go. And it says, "In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah, and the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. All right, so here we go. We've got the stage sort of set for us. And the first point I'd like to make tonight in looking at this is that worldly wisdom can get you into trouble, all right? And so I want you to kind of jump on our time machine and go back about 2,600 years-ish, and we're going to wind up in about 605 BC. And at this year, the crown prince of Babylon, named Nabuchodonosor, is a general in the Babylonian army. He's fighting the Egyptians under Pharaoh Necho II, and he really does a number on them at the Battle of Carchemish in 605. He just about wipes them out. History records that the Babylonians just had a complete victory over the Egyptians. According to the Babylonians, well, they bragged that they did not leave one Egyptian soldier alive. And so while the prince is chasing his enemies back to Egypt, he gets word that his father has just died. The great Nabopolassar, king of Babylon, is dead. So now the prince has to go back and get to the throne so that he can become the next king of Babylon. And this is the fellow that you and I know from the Bible as Nebuchadnezzar. Now, not everyone in the world respected Babylonian power, and generally the way this sort of worked was that if you were a smaller kingdom and it was a transition time in terms of going from one king to the next, there was a little bit of turnover there, you would take that opportunity to break away and not pay your tribute and basically take your chances with not having to be under somebody else's thumb for a while. And the way this usually worked is, I think everybody thought they had a better chance than they really did. Usually it wasn't very good. So the way it usually happens is the big kingdom that used to be in charge of you, they would kind of get everything settled and in order, and then they would come and steamroll you as a, your little bonus prize for trying to assert your autonomy. And so when you have about 605 or so, Nebuchadnezzar comes in, and he's going to go and invade Judah. And he attacks Jerusalem. That's when we think Daniel and his three friends are taken off into exile in the beautiful and brutal city of Babylon. And now Nebuchadnezzar is in charge, and he's got this host of young talent that he's gone and acquired in the land of Canaan from Judah and from some other places. And so now these guys are going to be put through an education program so that they can be good Babylonians. All right, so the problem is if you go back to Daniel chapter 1 and look at the text, what it says is, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And this is one of the most depressing verses in the entire Bible, I think. It says, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. Nebuchadnezzar comes in, bulldozes Judah, and God he doesn't just let it happen. God is instrumental in it happening. And not only that, but they take some of the stuff out of the temple and they take it to Babylon. So how do we get there? Why is that? Well, let's go back 3 years. We're going to go back to the time of a fellow named Jeremiah. And when Jeremiah was talking to the people, he had a number of things to tell them, warnings about what was going to happen, consequences concerning the sins of which they were guilty. And he preaches this sermon. And if we were to say that Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is the most famous sermon in the New Testament, Jeremiah's temple sermon may be the most famous one in the Old Testament. So in Jeremiah chapter 7, we've got this sermon that he preaches. And it says, Jeremiah 7, 1-4, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah from the Lord, and this is what he says: stand in the gate of the Lord's house and proclaim there this word and say, hear the word of the Lord, all you men of Judah who enter these gates to worship the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, amend your ways and your deeds, and I will let you dwell in this place. Do not trust in these deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. So Jeremiah is sending the people a warning message from God. And basically what they were doing is they sort of had this, I guess what you might say, conventional wisdom. Hey man, this is Jerusalem. God's not going to let anything happen to his crown jewel of his land, of his people, where his people are settled. It's got his temple here. His name is here. He's not going to let anything happen to this. He's not going to let himself get embarrassed. If we lose and people come to town and people destroy Jerusalem, that means God is going to be shamed. That would never happen. And so you can see their very human process, right? They're thinking through this. You could almost hear like grandparents telling their grandkids, children, come around, I'll tell you the story. When my father's father was your age, the Assyrians came under the mighty and terrible Sennacherib, and they came to Jerusalem in the time of Hezekiah, and they sieged the city so that no one could escape. And you can hear these stories being told, right? And one night, when the Assyrians had come around and there was no way anyone could escape, and faithful Hezekiah was making sure everybody was staying inside and no one was breaking ranks and no one was going outside, no one was opening the gate, the angel of the Lord, the destroyer, came in and he killed 185,000 soldiers that night. And Sennacherib had to go back home in shame. If God could do this in the time of Hezekiah, then God can do this now, right? You can almost hear these stories as they're being told from one generation to the next. And what apparently people were saying was, this is where God's house is. God's not going to let people come up and into his house and anything happen to him, or where his name is, where his people live. Well, there were a lot of people who were saying this. Apparently, there were a lot of false prophets and charlatans who were passing this kind of stuff around. So Jeremiah 5, verse 12, it says, they have spoken falsely of the Lord and have said, he will do nothing. No disaster will come upon us, nor shall we see sword or famine. Sometimes I wonder if that's what some people might have said during the time of the judges. Because these things are all covenant punishments. These are the punishments that people would get if they were unfaithful to the covenant. And they say, this is not going to happen. And there's not going to be no disaster. There's no sword, no war, no famine. Well, other people, Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 14, says, they have healed the wound of my people lightly, saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace. Okay, so people are following just sort of the conventional wisdom of the day. Our God's the best God. Our God's the one that beat the God of the Egyptians. Our God's the one that beat the gods of the Philistines. Our God's the one that beats every other God. Why should the Babylonians be any different? We've already seen the Assyrians come to town and go home in shame. Babylonians do the same. And so you can see how they reason through this and think through this. But the thing is, there's one other very famous story where exactly the same kind of thing happens. And that's in 1 Samuel chapter 4, when Hophni and Phinehas take the Ark of God, Ark of the Covenant, into battle. And you could almost hear the same kinds of things being said. Oh, we're going to take the Ark into battle. God will be with us. God would never let the Ark be taken. God would never let himself be shamed. He's not going to let the people lose. We're going to go out and we're going to be victorious. And seems like if that's what they were saying then, that's what they were saying right before the Babylonians show up on Jerusalem's doorstep. Worldly wisdom is hazardous to your health. All right. Now, the next thing we're going to say here is that worldly wisdom also says you go along to get along. Now we're going to pick up properly with Daniel and his friends. All right, so now we've got Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar taking off the first wave of exiles, and this happened around 605, 597, 586, were these three big waves that they came into Judah to take people off and take off spoils of war and kind of make sure that all these people were kind of under their thumb. And so what they would do, and the Assyrians would do this as well, so what they do is they go in, they attack, they take off prisoners of war, and it's usually people who have some kind of marketable skills. Right? You are a scribe, you know how to read and write, you're someone who maybe is an artist, you're someone who's a musician, or there's some important person, a thinker or a philosopher, something like that. Right? So they take off all the important people, the thinkers, the folks who have skills, anyone with promise. And so what happens is they take you back to Babylon, and then they sort of, my term is Babylonianize. I've never read that anywhere, but I'm not so arrogant to think that I've coined a new word here. But that's what I call it. And so they're going to Babylonianize you, right? And so you're going to be, now you're going to be loyal. You've got a new loyalty. You've got a new lifestyle. You've got a new home. And so the re-education program that Daniel and his friends are put through is designed to sort of transform them into good Babylonian subjects. And so they would have gotten an education in culture and religion and literature and, how to read the stars and how to read omens and all that kind of stuff. And so basically what they're going to be given is sort of a new worldview. Okay, I understand you guys are good Judeans. Now you're going to be good Babylonians, right? And to be absolutely honest with you, that's exactly what the world does. I understand that you're Christians. But, but the world is actually much sneakier about this, right? Because for the Babylonians and the Assyrians, their goal was, well, you're going to be a good Assyrian now. You're going to be a good Babylonian now. We're going to change your identity. The world knows better. The world is sneakier. The world will say, I understand that you're a Christian. You can still be Christian adjacent and still be good with God. You can make a few little concessions. It'll be okay, right? That's what the world will do. In fact, C.S. Lewis actually has something about this in a book called The Screwtape Letters, where it's got this devil and this senior devil in hell who's writing to his nephew who is called a junior tempter, and he's trying to tempt this guy that they call his patient. And he's trying to get him to not read his Bible, and basically to make sure that he is going to be doomed, right, when he dies. And the uncle, Wormwood, I believe his name is, he's writing to his nephew Screwtape. That may be backwards. I'm not sure, whichever one it is. The uncle is writing to his nephew, and he says, a moderated religion is better than no religion at all, and it's much more useful. You could be religious to a point. You could be religious as long as it doesn't go too far, as long as you're not too committed, as long as you kind of keep the lid on it, right? You moderate it a little bit. You kind of keep it down. That's still okay, and that's from a devil's perspective. Okay. So you could be a little religious. That's okay. Just don't be one of those Jesus freaks. And so the world's a little bit different because that's the world's angle on it today. Now, what Daniel and his friends are going to be doing here is the first test that they're going to have to go through is a test involving food. And so they put these, I don't know what they're, delicacies in front of them. We don't really know what that is or what that means. But it could be maybe food that had been offered in a sacrifice to an idol, right? So maybe you offer an animal, and then once you got the animal offered, you take like maybe the remnants or whatever is edible that's left, and you feed the king and his table with the choice parts of that, a little bit maybe like the priests did in the Old Testament. It could be that it was actual food that was offered to an idol. And so in Mesopotamia, they would often have idols, and the little statue that they would have, you would put food in front of it and it would eat. And then when it was done eating, you take the food, because I mean, nothing's gone, right? I mean, it doesn't actually do anything. So what you do is you take the food and then you go put it on the king's table, and the king eats it, right? And actually eats it this time. And so it could be that. The beverages that they're drinking could be drink offerings, maybe, or part of drink offerings that were poured out in worship to the gods. And so we don't really know what's going on here, but it could be any one of those things. But right after they get the food, the story about the food is set, then it talks about their names. And this is maybe one of the most significant parts of the story, because when you're talking about names, you're talking about something that is wrapped up in the identity of who you are, right? And so with the names of all of the guys here, I hope this is big enough to be legible to you. So when you get Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, every single one of them has a name that has a name of God in it. All right, so Daniel means my judge is El. Hananiah means Yahweh has been gracious. Mishael, who is what God is. And Azariah means Yahweh has helped. Every single one of these guys has a name that includes the name of God. All right, that's just who they are. They're good, faithful Judeans, right, who worship Yahweh. And what the Babylonians do is they change their names, sometimes into names that are similar, but they include Babylonian gods, right? So Belteshazzar means Bel, protect his life. Shadrach means the command of Aku. Meshach means who is what Aku is. And Abednego means servant of Nebo. Nebo is the same god for Nebuchadnezzar, actually. So that was kind of his chief god. So all of these guys have names that reflect the name of God, kind of part of their spiritual identity, right? Then they're all given names that reflect Babylonian gods, and the goal seems to be, well, you're in Babylon now. You're not in Israel, right? You're not in Judah. You're in Babylon, and so now you're going to worship these gods. You're going to worship Babylonian gods because you're going to be good Babylonians. And so that seems to be what this goal is. And when we look at names, that's sort of the starting point of our identity, right? So when we say, who are you? Generally speaking, we don't say, well, who am I? Let me go on this philosophical journey to tell you the essence of what makes me me. You know, we don't really do that. We say, oh, well, I'm Dewayne, right? That's my name. You know, who are you? You give your name. And so your name is sort of like that first entry level fundamental part of who you are. And so you know, you don't say, well, this is what I look like, you know, this is where I live. I mean, all those things these things change. And even when we're trying to figure out like who a person is, like the thing that we're really getting at is their name. Like, oh, you know, who's the guy that did this thing the last week, or who's that girl that has that, you know, that she's friends with so and so, right? You're getting at the name. The name is the important thing. And so here with these guys, it's, you know, your name used to reflect the God you served. Now your name is going to reflect the new gods that you serve. And so the Babylonians are trying to transform the identities of these guys. And every time somebody called their name, it was a reminder. You're not going back home. You're not going back to your God. You're not going to go back to worship at your temple. you're here now, and so you're going to be one of us. And so when we look at Daniel and his friends, now they have a choice. Are they going to accept this new identity? Are they going to live this way? Are they going to compromise? Are they going to cooperate? Are they just going to refuse, resist the whole, the everything? What are they going to do? And what we're going to see is that they will negotiate things as long as it doesn't impact their spirituality, right? Because you can go to later stories in the book of Daniel, like, the guys who are called to bow down in front of this idol that Nebuchadnezzar sets up. They refuse to do that. That's a step too far, right? I can't control. Okay, you're my masters now. I can't control what you call me. I can control what I worship, and I'm not worshiping that. And so into the fiery furnace you go. Daniel's going to come along, and in spite of the fact that his political enemies kind of manipulate the king into passing legislation that says you can't pray to anybody else for X number of times and X number of days, and Daniel, he's not going to stop praying to his God. Daniel, you can call me what you want. You can give me whatever name that you want. And for the sake of getting along, I'll answer to that name. But you're not going to tell me who I'm going to pray for, who I'm going to pray to. And so he doesn't change. Well, all of these guys, all four of these guys get into some sticky situations because of that. But the thing was, they didn't just grow a backbone at these moments. This was a decision, a life decision that they made and seem to have continued to have made, and it all started with refusing to eat a meal. It started there, and it never stopped. They could go along as long as it didn't impact their spiritual identity. The Apostle Paul touches on this maybe a little bit. 1 Corinthians 9. So he talks about being all things to all people so that by all possible means he might be able to save some. Right? So Paul can be someone who can negotiate social situations. Paul is someone who can maybe compromise on non-negotiables. Right? He can do a few things there. But if you're going to ask him to surrender some part of his identity as a Christian, that he will not do. And so he says, basically, by his example, there are some things that you can do where you can smooth off the rough edges, right? You can cooperate. But if it ever comes to you having to negotiate your Christian identity, that is completely off the table. Because Romans 12, verses 1 and 2, he will say this: I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. There's some things we can negotiate. Some things we can't, especially when it comes to anything that is going to impact our righteousness or our holiness or be something that is going to offend God. When people look at us, they should be able to see Jesus. People should be able to look at us and say, I see how you treat people. I see what you do for these folks. I see that sometimes you're very charitable. You're really patient. You're really kind. I see how you treat people that other people treat like garbage, and you treat them like people. You treat them like persons. When I look at you, I think I see Jesus. If people look at us and they're seeing the world, then we have some work to do. Last thing that I'll mention here is that worldly wisdom is infectious. So it's sort of like a contagion. I guess I sort of got that from, there was a book I read one time called The Sin, the Plague of Plagues. And it was by a Puritan named Ralph Venning. And this book was very, very intense, just talking about sin and the theology of sin. But he described it like a plague, like an infection. Not just an infection, but something that gets everyone. And worldly wisdom is a little bit like that. I think I'm not saying anything revolutionary when I say we're living in a world that seems almost like it's getting more alien all the time. There are more and more demands for Christians to conform. There are a lot of things that will influence us, and we can look around and see them. I mean, just making sure that we're being observant and careful. We can see all the things that impact us and sort of shape us or can mold us or influence us. Your upbringing, right? Your friends that we choose, education, personal experiences, all of them factor into how we see the world around us and what ideas that we adopt. And it can be influenced by books and literature, articles, social media, entertainment. One thing that we have to be very concerned about is technology. So when I guess this is something more like when I was younger, you always had to worry about the zombie apocalypse, and then there's a meme on Facebook that says, well, basically it's here, right? It's already here. Now the thing is, though, when we in our age, you know, I guess Gen X is my generation, and it's the one where like we saw a lot of changes. Like we went from not having cell phones at all to having a computer in your pocket that's more powerful than what, you know, sent spaceships to the moon, you know, and things like that, you know, where it was just like it used to be this and now it's like completely different over here. And so, you know, I remember the time my dad got his first cell phone, and it was like it was a brick like this, and you know he'd hold. I think it weighed like 10 pounds or something, and now you have a phone that's like, oh man, it's like if it's 4 ounces, oh, it's too heavy. It's like feels like I'm carrying the weight of the world in my pocket, you know. But the thing is that little thing, that little device, it gives you an amazing amount of access to all kinds of ideas and all kinds of worldviews, and yeah, it kind of does this because we're so wrapped up in it all the time. We spend so much time on these things, hours every day on them, and you know, you can see it. Just go to a restaurant right at lunchtime and see how many people like are sitting at tables and they're like texting the other person, and they're like 2 feet from, they're just on the other side of the table from them, and they're like texting them instead of talking to them. Or, you know, you go out and you look to see how many people are watching, you know, movies or TV shows or listening to podcasts or whatever it is that YouTube or whatever it is that they do. All of this is just like an open door, and all these things are flooding into our brains, right? All these things. And I tell my students at Faulkner, I tell them, your phone is basically just like this fire hydrant that's been unleashed, and you got all these ideas that are coming into your eyes and ears through movies, TV shows, music. Music's a big one. If you don't think that your music is promoting a worldview, you need to stop and listen more closely to the lyrics of the songs that you hear, because it is absolutely pressing a worldview into your brain. All right. So when we look at all this kind of thing, obviously, this is something that can influence us. It's something that we can pick up from all these various sources. Now, one thing that I think is a very, I guess, fairly easy place to find the influence that maybe media has on us is when you look at revenge movies. This is something that sort of interests me because, again, back in the day, and I think for a few people in here, these names will mean something. But back in the day, Charles Bronson, right? Charles Bronson was like the original, Mr. Vengeance in movies. Now it's John Wick, right? But there's something about that sort of touches us on our hearts, right? Because we all know injustice exists. We don't like it, right? I mean, who does? Who likes injustice? You have to be a monster. We all like to see the bad guy get his comeuppance, but does it really matter how he gets it? Does it matter to what degree or what level he gets it or she gets it? Let's say they do some minor offense. Is it okay to go ahead and just exterminate that person and everyone they know? That, I think, is one of the easiest things to see how we can go overboard in terms of letting the world influence us. Because it is infectious, right? You see someone who does something, well, that's wrong. I was sitting in a Bible class one time, and we were talking about Dinah and one of Jacob's daughters in the book of Genesis. And Dinah is violated by a Hittite prince. And Simeon and Levi, if you remember the story, Simeon and Levi, they say, okay, well, let's make a covenant with these guys. And, this guy wants to do that. He's going to marry Dinah. He wants to do, fix it or do the right thing or whatever you want to call that. And so they say, okay, but you got to make a covenant with us. And if you're going to make a covenant with us, you have to be circumcised. Okay, so this is the terms of the deal. All the guys do it. I don't know why, but they're really serious about this. And while the guys are recovering from this surgery, Simeon and Levi go and exterminate everyone. And I remember the guy who was teaching the Bible class says this is unjust. Because it wasn't just the guy who committed the sin. It wasn't just the guy who committed the offense. It was his entire community. And this guy said that was unjust. And another fellow pipes up in the audience. He says, why? Why shouldn't the entire community die for what this one guy did? Well, that kind of hits our sense of justice. We want justice, but it has to be the right way. It has to be to the right level for the right person, right? And so sometimes things like this, it kind of gets us to where doesn't really matter if it's proportionate. Revenge sometimes makes us go over the top. Well, there are other little things, other little compromises we can make. So, for instance, we could say, I got this person that I know. They're not perfect, but they're a good person, right? So she, maybe just has some habits that are sinful, or maybe this guy, maybe he uses some salty language, but that's okay because they're still a good person, It's okay if you're not 100% Christian, And when we look at that, is that, are we tolerating sin? Okay, yes, we're all error prone. We all have struggles. We all have temptations. We all fall into sin. We do, every one of us. Probably a lot more often than we would ever care to admit, or that we would like to even admit to ourselves. But is a little bit of sin okay? Right? I'll use an illustration that's not original to me. If you were to make a cup of coffee or a glass of Coke or tea or something for someone, you say, oh, this is really delicious. It's just got 1% poison in it. Is that okay? No. No, thank you. Hard pass on that one. Because just a little bit, that's dangerous. Guess what? Sin's the same way. A little bit of sin is just as deadly as a lot of sin. Sometimes we don't want to call out sin because it would be too judgmental. It's so much better, right? Worldly wisdom. So much better to be loving and tolerant and accepting. And besides, hey, who am I to point out somebody else's shortcomings? I've got plenty of my own, brother. And so why should I do that? And that one I would say, because you're not using yourself as the standard. You know, it would be one thing if you say, hey, I'm the standard. Yeah, I've got mistakes, but you got to live up to me. It's something else entirely to say, yes, you make mistakes and I make mistakes, but we're trying to both live up to standards set by God. That's the standards, right, that we're trying to get to. And so it's not, you've got some sin, friend, and you need to get that taken care of. It's God does not accept sin. And so we both need to get that taken care of. The last thing I think I've got here on the examples is, isn't it okay if you get your hands dirty in an unclean world? I mean, the world's not clean. You know, you're gonna get some of that on you from time to time. Well, I don't want to be a goody two shoes. I don't mean but a holy roller, more righteous than thou kind of person, right? No, we are going to make mistakes, but just because the world is flawed doesn't give us an excuse to not strive for something higher. All of this kind of reminds me of one thing the Apostle Paul says, and I'll kind of close out the lesson with this, and that is Colossians 2:8. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition. There are a lot of human-inspired wise sayings that we could pull out that would compromise the Christian message. They would compromise the holiness of God. They would compromise the perfect standard of righteousness that you and I are called to uphold. There are a lot of things that we see in our world around us that sound like they make sense, that sound like they're good things, and they even have kind of a veneer or a camouflage of virtue to them. Oh, it's just being tolerant, it's being accepting, it's being loving, it's being humble, right? There's a lot of things like that that we could bring out. But the thing is, those are some of the most dangerous because they sound good. And they touch on that human part of you and of your soul that you say, okay, well, I can see that. If you're not shooting for God's perfect standards, right? And when we look at examples like Daniel and his friends, what we're going to find is these are guys who did not do what the world expected them to do. They didn't do things according to conventional wisdom. They didn't follow lockstep with what the Babylonian masters that they had wanted them to do. Their wisdom came from a higher and better source. And so when it came time to interact with their Babylonian colleagues, they could do that, right? And that's not a problem. They could have friends, they could go to work, they could go home, they could do lots of things with their pagan neighbors around them. One thing they could not do is negotiate the spiritual standards that had been set by God. They weren't going to worship Babylonian gods. They weren't going to bow down and worship Nebuchadnezzar. They weren't going to, if you go to the New Testament Christians weren't going to burn incense to Caesar. And that sometimes became a problem for the New Testament church because if you go to some moments where you had the church under persecution, there would be times when people would say, okay, Christians, say I'm a Roman guy. Okay, man, I'm going to make it as easy as I can be on you. Here's this little pinch of incense, just this little pinch, just burn that. That's all you've got to do. Burn that to Caesar's honor. And you had Christians who would say, I don't care if it's a pound. I don't care if it's a pinch. I'm not offering anything to a man who claims to be God. And so you would have Christians who would be rounded up and they would be executed for this. It really caused a problem in the early church because there were some who went and said, you know what? I got a family. I got kids that need to be raised. I'll offer the pinch. Give me the pinch. And they did it. And after the wave of persecution would pass, then you would have these people who had basically committed apostasy. And they would come back and say, okay, well, we're going to start attending church now. You know, the authorities aren't looking at us. The Romans aren't after us. We want to go and start meeting with church again. You know, after we've been out because we got to keep up our cover that we're not really Christians anymore. And then you've got this guy over here who's half of his family got wiped out because he was faithful. And this guy over here who got to keep all of his family because he basically committed apostasy, and then later was just like, oh, well, you know, I just needs must. I had to do it. It was important. Had priorities. Well, his priorities were his family. Okay, that's a good priority to have. But our main priority is God. And I think we see that with Daniel. We see that with his friends. We see that in the early church with a lot of folks who endured persecution, who would gladly go and give their life because they knew where they were going in the next one. They knew that 5 seconds after they took their last breath on this earth, they knew exactly what their destination was. There may be someone here tonight who, you know, you've been thinking about spiritual things. Maybe you're not a Christian yet, but you've been thinking about these kinds of things. And maybe thinking more about them will kind of get you to think about, well, where am I going? What is my eternal destiny? Because this isn't everything. This is just a little tiny slice of eternity, and everything else is coming after this. And so maybe there's someone here tonight who you've been thinking about this, and you want to make a response to the gospel. You want to show everyone else that you have accepted Christ, that you are going to make a change in your behavior, you're going to live a righteous life, you want to be immersed for the remission of your sins, and you want to be a new creation, so that when that time comes for you to go home, you know exactly where you're going. Maybe someone here tonight who wants to make that decision, and if that is the case, we would love to help you take that last step in your journey to becoming one of Jesus' people. Do we have a song? Okay, and so if you want to go ahead and let us know now, we'll stand ready to help you while we sing our invitation song.